Before European contact, nearly 1/3 of America was covered in prairie. Grasslands that stretched for hundreds of miles and supported a beautiful and diverse tapestry of plants and animals, from the smallest prairie dog to the thundering herds of bison. Every species in the ecosystem is intricately linked to every other species, creating a complex web of interconnected threads that work together in perfect harmony. And for thousands of years, this harmony included humans. It's a central part of many indigenous American cultures that every other living thing is a relative, a family member to be treated with respect. In the Lakota language, this idea is captured by the phrase, "Mitakuye oyasin." It can be translated as all of my relatives, or less literally, we are all related. It's an appeal, a prayer that draws a connection between me and you, a connection with every bird and tree, every fish that swims or flower that grows, even the rocks that make up the mountain and the drops of water that flow in the stream. We all rely on each other. This week, we get to sit down with Dr. Julie Thorstenson. She's a wildlife biologist, member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation, Lakota, and executive director of the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Her work as executive director helps Native American and Alaska Native tribes with the conservation, protection, and enhancement of their fish and wildlife resources.
Welcome to Conservation Connection, the show where each week we do exactly what it sounds like, introduce you to people working in the field of conservation. I'm Sarah Catherine.
And I'm Chance.
And this is the show. So I have to admit that I thought Chance was absolutely ridiculous when he wanted to set up this hotline that we've been mentioning in the last couple of shows, this new phone number we have. But you guys have really been showing up. I've been kind of impressed.
I mean, it's pretty amazing the amount of engagement we've gotten from you guys. So if you haven't heard about it yet, the Conservation Connection hotline is 706-505-0582. You can text us with comments, questions, whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, we've been getting lots of amazing texts just saying how much you love the show, which show's your favorite, which is really exciting for us to hear, and then lots of people asking for sticker packs, which is super fun.
Speaking of sticker packs, big announcement this week. We have finally set up an online store so that you guys can support the show by buying merch. We have some really cool stuff on there.
It's been a long time coming. We got some really awesome shirts and cups for our fundraiser that we did last year. And now, not only can our local friends and family buy them, but so can you.
So if you guys scroll down to the show notes, you can click on that link. It should take you straight to our online store. If you guys have any problems or questions, hey, text the hotline.
Yeah, and this is new for us, so let us know if it's not working.
Something else that I really have been wanting to do for a while is create a way for our listeners, for you, to directly help with some of these issues that we're talking about. So we're launching a new strategy today. One of the things we talk about this episode is the vital role that indigenous tribes play when it comes to conservation. They manage some of the largest intact ecosystems of stuff like prairie grassland that we have left in the country. But I learned this week in this conversation with Dr. Julie Thorstenson that tribes do not receive Pittman-Robertson money. So if you don't know what that is, you can check out last episode. We talk about it quite a bit, but it means effectively that they don't receive the same base funding that like a state does for their conservation projects. So we would like to find a way to donate some money directly to the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation, of which Dr. Julie is an enrolled member, in order to help finance some of their efforts around black-footed ferrets, which are North America's most endangered mammal. So here's how you can help. Scroll down to that link in the bio. It's going to take you straight to our store on our website. We're selling hand-printed block prints of a little depiction I did of a couple of black-footed ferrets.
They're super cute.
They're absolutely adorable. I love ferrets. I had some. We're going to get into that. But half of the money that we get from these prints, we're going to donate directly to the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, specifically for their conservation efforts around black-footed ferrets.
So you may be hearing this episode on the first week it's released or a few weeks later, but we're going to be selling these prints until August 31st, so you have until then to support that.
Let's see what we can do.
Speaking of ferrets, didn't you have some when you were growing up?
Absolutely. Yes. They were such a fun pet to have. I mean, I had a ton of pets, but ferrets were an absolute blast.
So you had ferrets and groundhogs, is that right?
Prairie dogs.
Prairie dogs. Are prairie dogs different than groundhogs?
I'm pretty sure. I think groundhogs are more like a woodchuck type thing. Yeah, prairie dogs are their own thing.
This is a question I have all the time. Anyway, didn't you tell me it was illegal to have prairie dogs?
So technically not illegal to have them.
Okay.
At the time that I had them, it was illegal to move them across a property line. So, like...
So weird.
Once they were in the house, everything was totally legal. Getting them to the house was technically not allowed, and it's because people were really worried about monkeypox, which is a disease that mammals can carry. And actually, we talk a little bit of this episode about how dangerous some of these diseases can be, especially because they can be easily transmitted between humans and wildlife. But the monkeypox thing was pretty blown out of proportion, and they were technically rescues. So yeah, their names are Crash and Kodiak. They're the cutest little prairie dogs. I'll see if I can find a picture, and we'll put it on Instagram this week.
I wish I could have met them. That sounds precious. And I always wanted ferrets when I was growing up.
They're equal parts adorable and terrible. My favorite story of our ferrets growing up, this is probably elementary school. I had a really close friend named Damien who had come over and spent the night, and Dad went out to go get donuts for us in the morning. And we let the ferrets run free because they were litter box trained. We were sitting on the ground watching Saturday morning cartoons, and Damien had this big old tiger tail donut. You know, it's probably over a foot long. And we were like, dude, you don't want to sit on the ground with that because the ferrets are out. They will get it. And he did not believe us. He did not have pets. And sure enough, by the first commercial break, Frightful was the name of our ferret, comes tearing out from underneath the couch, runs past Damien's plate, grabs the donut, and dives under the other chair with it. Looked like a capital T as he was running because it was a long ferret and a long donut at a 90-degree angle. And Damien was just sitting there absolutely speechless. It was like, I'm living in the wild thornberries right now.
It's like I'm living in a zoo.
Well, which, I mean, was not that far from the truth.
That's really funny.
If you guys want to hear a little bit more about Sarah Catherine and I's story, you know, some of our background and history, we actually have a really cool episode out right now on Save What You Love podcast with Mark Titus. He did a full interview of us and did a really good job with it. We had so much fun chatting with him. If you guys go to his podcast right now, we're the most recent episode. And also, you should be listening to Save What You Love. It's a really cool show. If you like Conservation Connection, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to like his show.
Episode number 47 on his podcast right now. Getting into this week's episode, we are interviewing Dr. Julie Thorstenson, who is the executive director for the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society.
It's a really cool conversation that kind of centers around blending Western science with traditional ecological knowledge and kind of how she personally walks that line, both as Lakota and as an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation, but also holding a PhD in wildlife biology. So we talk a little bit about the role of the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society in supporting indigenous tribes in their own conservation efforts, as well as her work with black-footed ferret conservation in general.
Yeah, we cover a few different topics throughout the episode, some misconceptions that are commonly had. And this episode was kind of just a really big learning opportunity for Chance and myself as well.
I really like it when we get to bring an indigenous perspective on the show, because I think that there isn't often a seat at the table intentionally made for indigenous perspectives. And that's something that I want to be really clear about, is that this isn't the indigenous perspective. This is Dr. Julie's perspective specifically as a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation.
So with all that, we'll get to the show. Hope you enjoy. Today, we are joined by Julie Thorstenson, the Executive Director of the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. We're here at EarthX. Thank you so much for joining us today, Julie.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited about this conversation because I've wanted to have this conversation on the show for a while, and we've kind of hinted at it in a couple of previous episodes, but there's a rising acceptance, not only acceptance, but like intentional spotlight on the role of traditional knowledge from indigenous peoples and how that works in tandem with the more academia Western knowledge system. And you kind of sit at the intersection of both of these. So can you tell me a little bit about how you are connected to both sides of that conversation?
personally?
Yes.
So I am Lakota, and I'm a citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation, which is in north central South Dakota. I grew up there. I've lived there, worked there my entire life, my entire career. So I've been around the Lakota culture my entire life, not necessarily raised traditionally. I mean, my family's gone through the whole assimilation period like many Native people have. So much of the language and the culture that I'm learning now are more as an adult. But I also have a doctorate in biological sciences, so I'm definitely trained in the Western science framework. I guess for me personally, it's never really been like, oh, well, this is traditional ecological knowledge. Like now I'm putting traditional ecological knowledge and I'm consciously marrying it with Western science. It's just kind of already there. And I get that question a lot in my job, like, how do tribes integrate TEK into their work? And I'm like, well, it's there. Or from the Western science, I'll get, well, how do we, integrate that? How do we put that into Western science? And I'm like, well, it doesn't go through the same framework. Some of the questions we get a lot is like, well, how do you peer review it? And my response is always, isn't it peer reviewed? I mean, thousands and thousands of years of kind of trial and error and survival. That's the peer reviewed. So I guess for me personally, especially as I grow older, I've definitely found a more, appreciation for that traditional ecological knowledge. And I know when I first came back from college with my bachelor's, I worked for the tribe. I was a wildlife habitat biologist. And so I was really gung-ho to use my new degree and implement all these new methods, and really kind of just pausing and listening to some of the guys that had been on staff for years and had been raised more in traditional, and some of the things that they would say, just kind of being more aware and also just being more cognizant, I guess, less talking and more listening and watching, and you kind of see that. And so I guess for me, it's just, they're just kind of both there. It's part of who I am. I've always kind of had to straddle the line of being Indigenous and being non-Indigenous. And obviously I don't look Native, so I get that a lot. And then people question my nativeness, I guess. But I think I have a grown appreciation for it as I grow older and see how it definitely is still science. It's valid science.
Right. And I think that people often approach this conversation as like, these two are in conflict. How could they ever work together? And it's not true. Like, my personal journey that I see some echoes of this in is that I am trained as a scientist. I also have a degree in theater. I have studied both science and art at the tertiary level. And for me, they inform each other. I always say that I never would have graduated if I had only gotten a biology degree. I never would have graduated if I had only gotten a theater degree. But I am better both in artistic endeavors because I'm a scientist, and in scientific endeavors because I'm an artist. They inform each other. They work together. They're not in conflict with one another. And to kind of go back to your point of, isn't it peer reviewed? The parallel that I saw in my mind as you were saying that is, like, we talk about biomimicry a lot, which is the process of taking biological systems or adaptations, like the shape of a peregrine falcon as it dives through the air, and use that in our inventions and creations, and creating an airplane that uses that same shape to move through the air more effortlessly. That's important because evolution has created those shapes over so many hundreds of thousands of generations. In much the same way, when you have a culture that has lived in harmony and has listened to nature continuously that they have been a part of, the knowledge that didn't work gets discarded. And all that remains is the knowledge that is in accordance with the truth and with survivability. I mean, I don't want to get woo-woo or mystical about it, right? It comes back down to survivorship.
Right.
If you didn't have the knowledge to know where the food was, where the safe areas were during storms or during natural disasters, you didn't survive. Or you took that and passed that knowledge on so that the next generation that deals with those threats has the tools they need to deal with them. It is peer-reviewed. Over thousands and thousands of years, it absolutely has stood the test of truth.
Right. I think too, like a lot of people, because it's most of the native languages are not written languages, at least in the United States. Like we have oral traditions or oral, things are passed down. And so I think people are always like, well, those are stories. but there's stories designed to teach you. So there's always a message in there and something. But think about it. If I give you like some really dry concept out of a science textbook, how long do you remember that? But if I tell you a story about an animal or a human shifting into an animal and learning about the life cycle, like that will stick with you more. So I really think that our ancestors designed those for sustainability. And so those stories outlasted a lot of the colonization efforts. And yes, they weren't on a book, but also you can't burn them because they're in your head. So I think a lot of that has withstood some of that colonization practices just because it is an oral tradition and it is handed down through stories. And it's designed for you to remember and be able to retell it.
That's so funny because we position ourselves as a science communication organization. Part of what we do is we help scientists and knowledge makers get that knowledge in front of the public in a way that's fun and engaging and digestible. And, science communication is this growing field that started, I don't know, as an academic pursuit in the last 10 or 15 years. And oral traditions of storytelling is engaging transfer of scientific knowledge in many ways. I mean, I've never drawn that parallel before, but as you were speaking, like these are stories, they're designed to be remembered so that the knowledge is not lost. It's transferred. It's just a very funny parallel that I'm seeing between like what we're trying very hard to do, which is make Western science and knowledge digestible.
Right. And I think it's something that, me personally, I'd rather listen to an elder tell a story about the animals or tell a story about the creation than sit through a lot of academic presentations, honestly, that are dry and talking about p-values and using scientific only names, like things like that don't stick with me as much as listening to an elder tell a story.
Absolutely. I think that completely makes sense. And before we dive a little bit more into the work that you specifically do and some of what you're talking about here at EarthX, I would love to hear from you some of the misconceptions that you see. Like you said, people look at me and maybe I don't look as what you would think of, what you picture in your head, because I think so many people, they don't have the exposure to this information, to these cultures. So what are some of those misconceptions that you would like for people to know more about?
I think one thing is that there's one singular indigenous perspective. I don't know how many times, and I've been in this position for 5 years, but I'll get a call like, well, what's the indigenous perspective on this? Or what do tribes think about this? And I'm like, well, you're dealing with 574 federally recognized tribes that are all unique. They all look different, act different, have different languages, different stories. I mean, yeah, there are some commonalities amongst them, but definitely for our organization, we do not speak on behalf of tribes because they're so diverse. I think that's one of the things that people don't, and they have stereotypes.
It feels like asking, like, what do the Europeans think about this? And like, I think people in Belgium probably have very different ideas than people in England versus people,
Yeah. It's kind of like they always kind of try to lump all the tribes together. Or the other thing I really like to hear is, well, what are tribes working on? And I just counter with, well, just give me something. Just ask me. I can find a tribe that's working on it, because I'm not kidding. Tribes are working on just about everything, especially in the conservation world. You're not hearing about it because you're not reading about it in peer-reviewed articles. You're not seeing it in mainstream media, but trust me, it's going on. There's a lot of work going on. So I think just kind of that perception of what people think Native is, there's a lot of offensive things that will come out, like, well, how much Native are you? And I'm just like, well, how much whatever are you? Like, that's not a question, but the government has designed it to really probably try to extinguish the Native people at some point. So they keep blood quantum on 3 things, the government does: dogs, horses, and Native people.
Wow.
You said blood quantum?
Mm-hmm. How much blood quantum you are.
Interesting.
As like a measurement of like...
Yeah, like you're a quarter, or you're a quarter this, you're this.
Yeah.
And tribes, as they've gone through all the eras from treaty eras to reservation eras, assimilation, termination eras, all of those, some have adapted to the more kind of, they call it like the IRA, or Indian Reorganization Act, constitution, which kind of mimics more of like the Western or the United States looking government. So they can set who gets to be a member. But honestly, even that is kind of contrary to traditional cultural beliefs, because especially like in the Lakota culture, there were no orphans. Like we have a whole adoption ceremony. Like nobody was an orphan, and they adopted people into the tribe all the time.
Yeah.
They didn't ask you how much native you were or how much this you were. You were just brought in, and that was a huge part of our culture.
Let's take a moment to explore this idea of why it's problematic. It's a very American phenomenon to describe ancestry based on percentages. Chance often tells people that he's a quarter Mexican, a quarter German, and a quarter Hawaiian Portuguese. And that makes a lot of sense in this great melting pot of a country. It's fun to learn about where your ancestors came from and the cultures you're connected to. But for the indigenous people of America, there's a much darker history to the concept of a blood quantum. There's a lot more to the story, but the short version is that the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 formalized who was and was not legally considered a Native American, based specifically on the percentage of full-blood tribal ancestry. This completely disregarded how the tribes traditionally determined status, based on kinship, lineage, and family ties. Not only did it disregard traditional practices, but it was weaponized to reduce the number of people who could claim tribal membership, and was part of a systematic effort to erase or minimize indigenous culture. For many Native Americans, you either are or are not a member of the tribe. There is no percentage.
I mean, I think we could go forever on this topic
Yeah.
alone, and what it means to be part of a culture and to be accepted within that culture. And it doesn't come down to
What percent of your blood is
Yeah.
what?
right.
Yeah.
That's really not the defining question.
Right.
But to move, it feels strange to ask this question after you were like, what are the tribes working on? But to ask specifically what the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society is working on. What are some of your current objectives and the work that you're doing?
Sure. So our mission is to assist Native American and Alaska Native tribes with the conservation, preservation, and enhancement of their fish and wildlife resources. So we're definitely not coming in like, hey, we're here to save the day. We have all the answers. We're always in a listening mode, and we listen. We try to connect. So we have a huge network, and we try to connect tribes with other resources. So tribes do not receive Pittman Robertson Dingell Johnson funds. Most people don't realize that either. So there's
that's the money that comes from like the sale of guns and firearms, right?
fishing lures, goes to the states based on population, based on their land base. So tribes are not included in that. They're not exempt from it. We still pay the tax as consumers, but we don't receive any of the funding. So for tribes, there's really no base funding. There's no funding that they can rely on every year. There's some federal funding, but it's not something that's equally distributed to all 574 tribes. And so, you get different programs based on their ability really to fundraise or grant write. So what we do is we do technical assistance, and we're really focused on reducing barriers, whether that be to funding or to resources. We're trying to help build capacity within Indian country. We have an education program that works with Native youth, trying to get them interested in natural resource career. Because honestly, like I don't want to sound arrogant or anything, but I'm a Lakota PhD. There's not a lot of us in the world, especially not in biological sciences. And within the fish and wildlife profession, less than 1% of the profession is American Indian Alaska Native. So we're trying constantly to just try to get more students interested in natural resources, try to get them to work for the tribe. We try to help tribes with funding. That's always funding and capacity are two of the biggest needs that tribes will tell us. So we try to have technical assistance, help them navigate the grant world. We're starting to work more with the philanthropy world, and honestly just trying to amplify their stories and the work they're doing, because it's just phenomenal.
We saw that you did some research on black-footed ferret.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So does that relate into anything you're working on now, or was that kind of more while you were getting your PhD? I'm sure there's some intersection.
Yeah, so actually it wasn't researched, but Cheyenne River was the third largest reintroduction site at one time. And so I was working as a biologist, and I got to help with the black-footed ferret recovery efforts on our reservation. At one time, we had 180 black-footed ferrets on the reservation, and then plague hit and pretty much decimated the population. that was a cool job. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Like getting to do, I mean, honestly, that's the thing I miss most about being in more administration is the field work.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir right here. I used to spend my time like in salt marshes catching turtles.
Yeah.
And I love what I do, but I'm always looking for opportunities to get back out in the field.
Yeah.
If you could just take a second for us and describe the story of the black-footed ferret as a conservation effort, since it's become an issue for ferrets, what has caused the decline, what is their importance, and what are some of the reintroduction efforts that are happening?
Okay, you're making me pull some files from way back, but they are the most endangered mammal in North America. They were thought to be extinct, I believe, in the 70s, and then in 1981, I think, a rancher's dog brought one up somewhere in Wyoming, and so they went out and started capturing. I think they might have captured 19 from that population, and then they started dying. So the population that exists now is from 7 or 9 individuals, and so you start to see some genetic bottleneck issues and things like that. But they've been trying to reintroduce them since probably the 90s. And the tribes still have a lot of the large, intact, contiguous prairie dog populations and colonies because a lot of that was, of course, reduced for farming efforts or poisoned for different things. And so the tribes still have probably some of the largest colonies. So that's why they're good partners. So we have reintroduction sites all over the Great Plains. I think there's 3 or 4 in Montana, 3 or 4 in South Dakota. I think Arizona, maybe the Navajo Nation also has one. So they've been good partners of the reintroduction effort. But they're susceptible to plague, flu, COVID. It's really hard. And then also the genetic diversity. I did just read they cloned 2 from some of the genetic material from the original population that they brought in, that the genetics are not part of the current wild population.
Yeah, they're really interesting. So if I'm also pulling files from the back of my mind here. If I remember right, black-footed ferrets, they were a species that rely on prairie dogs as a prey source, and also as habitat. They live in the prairie dog holes, and prairie dogs are very reliant on, prairies, imagine that. So one of the major ecological changes that has happened on this landscape over the last couple hundred years is the loss of prairies because they're disturbance-reliant ecosystems. You have to have fire. You have to have buffalo that are crossing and periodically eating back and maintaining it at that early successional stage in order to have healthy grasslands.
Right.
Well, when those ecosystems disappeared and when we exterminated buffalo, exterminated prairie dogs because they were, quote, damaging to our agricultural systems, you lose the prairies, you lose the prairie dogs, you lose the black-footed ferrets. They're the narrowest top of the pyramid. They're the apex predator in many ways for that system. And we thought they were completely gone. And it's been a long and hard road to go from, the 19 individuals or this, 7 or 8 that we got into the breeding program to do you know what the current population estimate is?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me. I think it's 300. I know the Badlands National Park, I think they have the largest population, but they do pretty intensive plague mitigation efforts.
Yes, that plague. The same one that killed half of Europe in the 14th century. So here's the deal. The same species of bacteria that caused bubonic plague in Europe is still around, and it can cause massive issues with wild mammal species, especially rodents and mustelids like ferrets. Yersinia pestis, or Y. pestis for short, is the bacterium that causes the disease, and it uses fleas to move from one individual to another. When it enters a prairie dog colony, it can kill upwards of 90% of the individuals that live in that colony. When a black-footed ferret that eats almost exclusively prairie dogs catches one that's sick, the disease takes hold in the ferret too, and ferrets need a lot of food. A study from the 80s that estimated the caloric requirements of one mom and her litter calculated that she needed to catch between 474 and 1,471 prairie dogs every year to survive. So even if only a few prairie dogs are sick, the likelihood of a ferret catching plague is really high. When there's a large population of wild ferrets, a few that are lost to disease each year isn't a big deal. But when there's only a few hundred left in the world, that loss of genetic diversity is really significant. So conservationists go to huge lengths to protect prairie dogs and the ferrets by administering vaccinations and dusting their tunnels with agents that kill the fleas that spread the disease. If you'd like to help support black-footed ferret conservation efforts on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, you can click on the link in the show notes to purchase a block print from our online store. Half of the proceeds from each sale will be donated directly to support black-footed ferret conservation.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing more efforts around the mitigation for plague, but it's costly. Ferrets they're kind of labor intensive, like you have to.
You can say that again.
Yeah, you got to vaccinate them and spotlight for them, and it's still one of my favorite things to do. But they are labor intensive, and then they're susceptible to so many things, like I said, COVID and the common flu and sylvatic plague and anything else. But I know when the plague first went through in early 2000s in South Dakota, one of my counterparts at one of the other tribes said they had saw a colony that had plagued out, and she said it was so surreal to go out there on that prairie dog town because life was like nothing was there. Before you would go out and you would see coyotes or badgers and burrowing owls and some of the predator birds, eagles, hawks. And she's like, there was nothing. There's just nothing there because the prairie dog was gone. So it's definitely, they're not the most popular animal, a prairie dog isn't, but they are definitely an important part of the ecosystem, especially the prairie ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like we have a lot of stories kind of similar to this about how people don't live in harmony with nature, especially just like apart from the tribes. I think obviously Native Americans are kind of known for living in harmony with nature a little more. So I would love to hear some of the times you've seen people living in harmony with nature and the experiences you've had and what gives you hope that we can continue doing more of this in the future.
Well, I think one thing that's different in Indigenous communities is there seems to be a lot of them will have some type of language or some type of saying, like in Lakota, it's Mentaki Owasi, and it means we're all related. So everything is related. Everything has a place. And one of the things that I see with the difference between kind of Indigenous perspective, I guess, and Western perspective or Western science is that in the Western science, we're the external manager. So we're always manipulating because we're trying to manage, right? We're trying to change how things are done. We're trying to
control variables,
control everything. And in Indigenous communities, we're part of the ecosystem. Like we're naturally part of it. And the difference is like, especially with the Lakota, like we are the most pitiful of the species. Like our creation story, we're dying. We're living up on an earth and we're dying because we can't take care of ourselves. And the animals kind of come together and say, okay, like we need to help these two-leggeds. They're so pitiful. We need to figure out how to help them. And the buffalo's like, okay, like, I'll do it. And that's why we're so closely connected with the buffalo. There's very similar, and I'm not as familiar with the stories, but there's similar stories throughout Indian country that are like that. The salmon are very important to the Northwest tribes, and also the Alaska tribes. And so all of those things have a place. So I think what I see is you can see the way that we treat things. And with tribes, a lot of times you'll hear people address wildlife as their relatives. Like, this is my relative, and so we have to take care of it, our relative. So there's a sense of kind of reciprocity that exists because the animals took care of us. Now we have to take care of them. So I think you kind of see that just the way that tribes interact with the ecosystem. I think that's it. I have one story that I have had permission to retell from the Santa Ana Pueblo. They need deer parts for their ceremonies. And so the Natural Resource Department found out that there wasn't enough deer and people were actually having to buy deer parts for ceremonies. So they started working to reintroduce the deer population or bring the deer population back to their homelands. And once they did that, then someone said, hey, we also need turkey feathers. So they did a large project. They removed a lot of invasive species and they restored the turkey. And they brought the pronghorn back too. And what they saw is like the ecosystem just started kind of naturally, as they would bring these species back, then it started kind of naturally adjusting itself back. So then they started seeing predator animals, they started seeing mountain lions, they started seeing bears, started seeing all that interaction. But it really, the motivation behind it was the need for tribes, their cultural and their spiritual needs is what motivated that. So
that's incredible. Yeah, I love all of that. And I I very often say that one of the biggest issues in how we think about nature in the Western world is that we always consider ourselves apart from it.
Right.
Nature's a thing that you go visit on the weekends because you want to go hiking, and not something that you're immersed in all day, every day. And I actively try to change that perspective in myself, that we are part of this. And I'm really glad to have heard you bring up the Lakota phrase. And I actually don't know that I've ever heard it pronounced correctly.
Well, I'm not sure if I pronounced. I mean, I think it's pretty correctly, but
You probably did it better than we could.
Yeah, because I was the kid that read a ton, and so I would come across words that I had no idea how to pronounce, but I knew what they were and I knew what they meant. So like the way that I have always pronounced it was Mitakui Oyesen.
That's not right.
And I know that's not right. And so
Kind of sounds more Hawaiian.
Yeah, which is fair because I've got ties to Hawaii as well. But that idea of we're all connected, we're all one, and we're relatives with one another, I think is so important in, moving forward and living in harmony with the support system. That, the only reason that we're on this planet is because it is a living planet and we're part of a system that heals itself and renews itself.
Right. One of my colleagues, Dr. Sarah Hoagland, she's a citizen of Pueblo Laguna, and she's done a lot of research, but she brought up, like, it just changes your mindset when you start referring to wildlife as your relative. Like, you treat your relative differently, right? Like,
That's family.
You have like a different way of interacting. And so I think that is important. It really does. It does just change your mindset of how you're working, how you're doing things.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us today. This is really an enlightening conversation, and I think it's an important one to have the conversation around building a relationship with the environment and feeling like you're part of it.
Pilamie, thank you.
I really hope y'all enjoyed listening to that episode. We had just an amazing time recording it while we were at EarthX in Dallas this year.
Yeah, I mean, it was just fun to be in the room with Julie. She's just a really calming presence, and so getting to hang out with her and chat with her about her work was an absolute blast. So, Sarah Catherine, what did you learn this week?
I think the biggest thing that surprised me was what Julie said about blood quantum and the United States government keeping blood quantum on dogs, horses, and indigenous people, and just how that has no basis in Native American tradition. And it's basically a way that the U.S. looks at determining tribal enrollment and eligibility. Yeah,
I didn't really understand why it would be offensive to be like, oh, what % Native American are you? But
right, because we're kind of like, oh, I'm this much German.
Right,
you're like a quarter Mexican, a quarter Portuguese.
Right, but for indigenous people in the U.S., it was used systematically to not allow tribal people to be enrolled in their tribe. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to kind of dive a little bit deeper into this week.
What did you learn?
I was really shocked to learn that tribes are not eligible for Pittman-Robertson money. So there's no funding coming from the federal government like they give to the states for conservation purposes. I mean, I guess I had just never thought about it, but that was pretty surprising to me, especially because they're managing such cool, intact ecosystems in a way that is kind of only possible on tribal land. So if you're listening and you want to help out with black-footed ferret conservation projects on the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation's land, you guys can go to the link in the bio. You can click to purchase a really cool handmade art print that I made of some black-footed ferrets. And half of the money from the sale of those prints is going to go directly to the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation.
And the other half of it goes to supporting us and our nonprofit, Conservation Connection.
Yeah, I think people forget that we are also a 501c3 because we don't talk about it a whole lot. But
right.
All of the money from the sale of those prints is either going to stay with our nonprofit or it's going to go directly to black-footed ferret conservation efforts. I wanted to take a second here and shout out some of the people that texted the Conservation Connection hotline over the last week or two. So thank you to Stone, Amanda, Ash, Carmen, Amber, Jonathan, Hunter, Michaela, Roger, and everybody else who texted but didn't give me your name. It's seriously been the best part of my week to get basically a daily dose of compliments about the show and how much you all are enjoying it. Keep an eye on your mail because those sticker packs we sent out should be headed your way pretty soon. If you haven't reached out to us on the hotline, I would love to know what you thought of this week's episode, so give me a text.
Just as a reminder, the hotline number is 505-0582.
So, Sir Catherine, what do we have coming up next week?
So next week, we're having a conversation with Shannon DeRuzo. She is the president of Turtle Island, which is an organization that works to save turtles and tortoises from extinction through acute rescue, care, research, breeding, and rewilding. Of the 360 recognized species of turtle and tortoises in the world, more than half of them are classified by the IUCN as threatened with extinction. So they focus on way more than just sea turtles, which is kind of the popular one that we hear about a lot.
Yeah, I think she gives a stat where it's like sea turtles make up less than 3% of all turtle species. I think something like that is close, but they get the vast majority of funding available for conserving turtles. So they focus on all of the other species that aren't maybe as charismatic or well known, but still are really important species in their ecosystems.
Yeah, so you can listen in next week to hear about all of these other turtle species and the amazing work that they're doing.
See you next week.